hey, in the next few hours you are going to receive tons of new techniques, tips and informations. So if you don't want to get lost and if you want to keep up with improving in your production, then join Letsynthesize production group on Facebook. You can find the link to it under the video. Before we start building up the song, let me share you a few pro tips. For heavy basses there are several techniques. Use heavy distortion to create harmonics on the bass that later you can filter out to create those typical vocally sounds. Now, it is a little hard to make in Serum because of limited distortion possibilities. There is another workaround, for example, to use a noise oscillator to replace those harmonics coming from distortion. So if you don't want to use a distortion to create those harmonics, just use a noise oscillator and route it into the filter. For fattening up the bass, you can add the same sound but with different processes as a layer to the same sound. There are hundreds of ways you can do that. Also, heavy compression and EQing can be a key, especially with saturation, to make the sounds, especially the basses, really fat. Now, I don't recommend this for synth sounds. You always want to filter out the low end, the very low end, the sub from your basses and use a separate sub on a separate track.
Hey, yo, raise 'em up.
If you do that, obviously you want to group the mid basses, the middle basses, and process them separately. Pro tips for drums. Now, the first and most essential part is always use quality drum sounds. If you use poor quality drums, your song will always sound weak. It doesn't matter what process you use on them, a weak drum sound will always sound weak. It's okay to change drum sounds during building up the song. The key is to use drums that cut through the mix well, and that depends not only your process but the drum sounds as well. So obviously you want to go after the fattest sound as possible, and not only on itself but compared to your musical surroundings, the basses and other elements. To achieve this the easiest, I prefer putting every drum hit in a drum rack. They are very flexible and it's very easy to change drum sounds with that, and you can keep your project clean. Also, it can be a good idea to process the tops separately with, for example, slight compression and EQing. Let me share you a pro tip for intros. Heavy drops require similar color intros, so I suggest you making some atmospheric dark intro for very heavy and violent, crazy hard bass sounds. Now, if you want to match your intro with the drop very efficiently, I always like to introduce the main bass in the build-up section, so you can easier match the intro with the drop. Another very important thing is the drop always must be louder than the intro, and not only in volume but in frequency-wise also. So, for example, I would use a lighter drum in the intro than in the drop, for example. Arrangement-wise, always keep in mind that the intro should evolve a lot. For example, do that with introducing new elements every 4 bars maximum. Add lots of switches, stops and other elements in the drop to make it even crazier. People love these things nowadays. It can be a good idea to add different elements in the second intro, for example, like a piano. We are going to use this in this song. Always change stuff in the second drop because people love diverse drops. It's, I would say, very obvious, but don't fool yourself when you are very tired building up your song. Building up a nice bass line, a nice bass sequence using very different bass sounds. Now, that's a hard thing, but basically what I like to do when I create a bass sound, I like to duplicate it, add some changes to the synth, I mean in the synthesizer or in the process, and use it as a separate bass sound. So for example, you can easily create a percussive bass sound from a wobble. They always play very well together. So these were my pro tips, and in the next video we're going to start building up this crazy hard, heavy, violent dubstep song from scratch. So see you in the next video.